Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local. Hi again, everybody. Welcome back to the Near Memo with Mike Blumenthal, David Mim, and Greg Sterling, in case you were wondering who we were. And today, as always, we'll be talking about Google. And Mike is going to talk about how Google is maximizing local in some of the SERPs, including ads. David is going to be talking about how the SERP is so full of modules and crap that organic results are getting lost or being marginalized. And I'm going to talk about Jess Peck's article about how Google is making its product worse with AI overviews and the problem, which she says is inherent in LLMs, that Google may not be able to solve in terms of accuracy of information. So let's get into it. Mike, why don't you lead us off?
Sure. So today in the SEO community in general, there's a lot of talk about the impact of AI on search. And while that's broadly true, in local, what has gone largely uncommented on is how Google is extending their local listing graph into virtually every aspect of local search results. And so what we're seeing in many of our tests that we're doing is an increasing number of influences of the local pack, not just on the pack itself, but expansion of the packs, pack alternatives, but in ads, with the location assets and local service ads, but also in organic. We're seeing the return of the plus box. You remember the plus box from 2008?
Wow.
It's now back in organic, where organic results are now showing a little map pin below them, and you click on it, the map pops out. And then we're seeing these massive tests. I uncovered what I call the quad pack the other day, which is a big 4 square images of local listings. We've long seen sort of people search by images. We've seen order by images, but we also, Joy Hawkins several weeks ago noticed a 5-pack. And then I've been documenting what I call the Infinity Pack, which is the 678 pack, 678 local listings and nothing else.
It's getting very confusing with all these naming conventions, Mike. You're going to have to start a spreadsheet, I think.
Well, a quad pack, an Infinity Pack, I think a 3-pack, those are all pretty obvious, but if you need definitions, come see Greg. And then what we're seeing in our research, our consumer behavior research in the EU, and this is not a test, this is the way the SERPs are, which is what I call the twin pack, right? So literally 2-3 packs, very high in the search results, virtually no organic results other than this thing called the Places site, which is a horizontal carousel of organic results.
Right.
So in Europe,
which Google plugged in to comply with the Digital Markets Act.
Tried to comply with DMA.
To at least signal to regulators that they were aware of their obligation. I think compliance would be
yes, a more nuanced response. Yes.
Yes.
All right.
So when you look at European results, local service ads, sponsored ads, sometimes with local assets, local pack, and then you might see a Places site, which is just one organic space on the results with the carousel. But then you might see people also ask another local pack, and then you'd see an organic result. I mean, the first organic result might be 2-3 scrolls down the screen, true organic result in Europe. And so
that's on desktop. On mobile, that's been the case for a while, but this is on a desktop search.
Mobile and desktop. That's right. Yep. And so in general, Google's rolling out AI, but in local searches, particularly near me searches, they are not just doubling down; they are tripling down on entity results and influences of entity results in the pack. And I know everybody focuses on AI as the big change, but to me, this is an equally big change that is occurring in local. And it speaks to the idea that Google controls their local entities and the local information more than they control almost any other piece of information. And they almost don't need AI to present that. They can just load up the results with it and still have, I think, happy searchers. I'm not sure.
Yeah,
Thoughts?
well,
I left you speechless.
yeah,
Wow.
speechless. No, I had a number of things colliding in my brain. The thing that I think is like, this is maybe a esoteric point that we don't need to get into in too much depth, but it feels like Google, there's always been this sort of discussion, especially for Section 230 purposes, about is Google a publisher? Is Google simply a compiler of information? Publishers are subject to different rules in some sense than everybody else who's just kind of organizing information or presenting information, and all of the Google local stuff, which Google likes to sort of point to as third-party information, is really kind of makes Google a publisher. It's Google's own information in a certain way, even though the factual information comes from the real world. That's maybe not something that's entirely relevant to the conversation, but
I think it is. I think Google is knowingly becoming a publisher, and at every front attempting to delay regulation and inclusion of themselves in that regulation by arguing it's not, understanding that at some point their hand's going to be slapped and they're going to be declared a publisher. This is true with AI, and I think it's true with local. And I think
those AI organized pages push them in that direction as well, right? I mean, They're not simply kind of indexing the most relevant and most authoritative sites. They're constructing a certain kind of narrative on that page using different side elements, which David is going to talk about.
They're constructing this narrative, and I read that subsequent to constructing the narrative, they then go out and try to find reference sites for it. In other words, it doesn't work the other way from what I understood, that they construct the narrative through the AI generative capacity and then find the references that reinforce that narrative, which again speaks to your point about them being a publisher, and local speaks to them bebeing a publisher, even though this information's in the public domain.
Yeah, and that's what the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, sort of alluded to in a text, and I think it was Google versus Gonzalez, where they were suggesting that if Google were to essentially the equivalent of AI overviews, start to turn Google into a publisher and exempt it from Section 230 liability protection, but that's another discussion.
So I think what this means in terms of tactics, though, is that entity-related attributes are going to be ever more important, making sure, for example, that Google has insight into your product graph so that they can include the plus box. They can include you in the product. There's a product pack now. If you do a search on
sure,
baseball bats in Buffalo, you'll get a pack with available products. And so I think it means doubling down on your understanding of and your implementation of entities. And as we've talked about last week, mentions of your business, mentions of the product you carry, all of the stuff around the broader sort of scope of entity ranking rather than organic ranking. Not that your site isn't important. It's just, as David has always said, it's important as a data source for Google, not necessarily because it's going to show up in the organic results. Right.
And it is important in some contexts, in some verticals, it's very important to consumers, yes. Right? I mean, consumers will click through from GBP to the site to get more information.
Correct. So that's a good segue for you.
Before we segue, I did have a couple of thoughts, but I didn't want to interrupt the collision happening in Greg's mind of all of his thoughts.
Sorry.
So Mike, I think that this is clear evidence that, so it's evidence for a trend that we've been sort of highlighting as much of the rest of the SEO community has been panicking around the introduction of AI overviews in their search results. Just the fact that, we don't see that many AI overviews in local today. And the ones that we do see are generally featuring something like stuff. Google business profiles, even if that's not what they're going to be called in AI overviews. And so at the end of the day, it's not necessarily that AI overviews are going to sort of take away visibility from your GBPs. It's just that you might have to think about different things that are triggering the presence of your profile AI overviews, just like
And
they
it
are.
may change the keyword mix, right? Like for me rurally, I want things that are 80 miles away, not things that are 2 miles away, because there are no things 2 miles away,
Well, you have to
So I
be,
think
yeah, you have to be more explicit about that, probably.
right.
And I would also say this goes back to a conversation I had with Tom Anthony last year at SMX in Berlin, which is that I think we both feel that the real promise of even the initial Gemini demo that we saw, 9 months ago or whatever now, it was that of a sort of an iterative conversation or a series of faceted searches, right? That kind of led the demoer to a set of businesses from which he could buy certain party favors for his daughter's party. And that notion of a faceted search really lends itself well to these kinds of semantic references that you're talking about around the web, Mike, where, okay, if Google picks up that this business is mentioned on this blog post about, where to find a specific party favor in Buffalo, then that it's not that business's website is going to show up in the AI overview, but probably it will show up as a physical destination to go and buy that thing. And so I think that you really do need to be thinking about the things that the entity of your business is sort of known for, as opposed to the things that your website is known for per se.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.